praise is due to her. I'm studying your law, your education, your school system, but I'm not your slave. I will never bow down to you. As I get prepared to bring on Dr. Tony Martin, the man who certainly fought hard on the front lines. We have some of the black nation's best scholars here tonight. But again, the black Holocaust is the most vicious, worst and malicious Holocaust ever to exist in the annals of time, brothers and sisters. So stop being soft on your enemy. Stop being weak with your enemy. Look how they did in Somalia. Look how they did after the imperialists went into Somalia when our brothers struck back. Look how they did when they shot the white man's helicopters out the sky in Somalia. I know some of you didn't like it, but I said all praise is due to Allah. That was the happiest day since the LA riots for me. The only way you get justice is when you make justice, brothers and sisters. They didn't want to let the LA-4 go like they let them go. It was you who made them go because they knew there was Reginald Denny's driving in trucks all over the country. They knew that you had the potential to snatch crackers out their trucks all over the country. So they let them brothers go because you rising up. You punked them out. You punked them out. So as I conclude and prepare to bring Dr. Martin on, I don't speak for all Howard University students. No, I don't. I don't speak for the weaker ones. I don't speak for the buck dancers. I speak for the ones who are ready to rise up and take your place in history. I speak for those ones. As I conclude, the black Holocaust is still going on today. They're waging war against black males. They're waging war against young black men. And in the National Institute of Health, they are still studying us and saying that we're criminals by nature. And they're studying, trying to find drugs and to go into the young black males to cool out our aggressiveness because they're saying we're monkeys in the wild. How can this white man call us criminals by nature? He's the #1 criminal. He's the #1 murderer. He's the #1 liar.
Thank you very much for the beautiful introduction. Thank you very much, Brother Malik Shabazz, for inviting me here for this historic occasion tonight. As Brother Shabazz and others have said, we live in a very exciting time, a time when our people are rising up, a time when we will no longer bow down, as Brother Malik said. My topic for tonight is the African Holocaust. Our people have suffered grievously for the last 500 years. Our people have suffered so much in the last 500 years that it's one of the great miracles of history that any of us have survived at all. Our people have survived the greatest Holocaust, the greatest onslaught that any people, any race of people has ever been called upon to face in the whole of human history. Our people have been called upon to face a struggle where other people who have faced lesser struggles have died. As we look around the world today, we see any number of people who have died, who have disappeared from the face of the earth, who had to deal with the kind of struggle that our people have had to fight in the last 500 years. If we look at the Caribbean, 500 years ago when Columbus lost his way and stumbled upon the Caribbean islands, he met a race of people in the Caribbean islands, people called Arawaks and Caribs. According to the Spanish chroniclers and historians who came shortly after Columbus, the island of Hispaniola, to take one island in the Caribbean, was one of the most populous islands they'd ever seen. Some historians estimate that there were anything from 600,000 to perhaps 11 million people on the island of Hispaniola in 1492, when Columbus, 10,000 miles off course, stumbled upon that island. Within about 40 or 50 years of Columbus's arrival in Hispaniola, there were a few hundred Arawaks left. A whole race of people had disappeared from the face of the earth. The same thing happened in the other islands. The same thing happened in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Jamaica, in the Bahama Islands, later on in the other islands as well. You had a whole race of people who disappeared from the face of the earth when called upon to face the kind of onslaught that African peoples have been fighting for the last 500 years. You look around other parts of the world and the story, this dismal story repeats itself over and over again. You come to North America, to the Native Americans, you go to Central America, to South America, you go to Australia with the Aborigines. Australia, a country which for years was bold-faced enough to have what they called a whites-only immigration policy. A country which was once the domain of black people, where they exterminated almost entirely the native black race. You have a case of Tasmania, the large island south of Australia, where every single black, white, black man, woman, and child in Tasmania was wiped out, totally wiped out by the white usurpers. And the story repeats itself over and over again, and that's the kind of beast that African people have been struggling with for the last 500 years. A people who have committed genocide, who have perpetrated holocausts everywhere they went as they expanded overseas, beginning in the 15th century, in the 1400s, beginning with the Portuguese and the Spaniards, later on with the British and the French and the Dutch and the Danes and the others. You can trace the history of European expansion overseas by its history of genocide. Everywhere they went, they committed genocide. Yes, sir. So I say the only reason why Africans have survived is, first of all, because there were so many of us to begin with. Secondly, because of our great resilience. Yes, sir. We were born fighters. We fought a good fight, a fight that nobody else fought. The mere fact of having survived in that situation where other people succumbed entirely is in itself a great triumph, a great epic, one of the great epics of human history. We survived because we had great enlightened leadership. We have been blessed as a race of people over the years with enlightened, fearless leadership. We have been blessed over the years with leaders who were dedicated to the people, who were honest, who had a correct ideology. In recent years, that ideology has manifested itself in a variety of forms of African or black nationalism. The methods used by the Europeans to exterminate us and to exterminate other people were legion. Sometimes the Europeans waged total war against the unfortunate people they came in contact with. Sometimes they waged wanton destruction. In the case of the Caribbean, in Hispaniola, the island which today is shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, the Spanish abolitionist priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, tells us that the Spaniards in Hispaniola and the other islands after Columbus waged wanton destructive fury upon the native inhabitants. They would go competitions among themselves to see who could kill the most so-called Indians. They call them Indians. Who could kill the most Indians in a day. They would go competitions among themselves to see who among the Spaniards could cut off an Indian so-called head with one blow of the sword. They would gather Indian so-called notables in a large building, set the building on fire. They would barbecue the Arawaks, 13 at a time, in honor of Jesus Christ and his 12 apostles. Kill them, burn them to death, barbecue them. They would, according to Las Casas, they would cut off the limbs of Indian children and throw them to their dogs. Sometimes they supplemented their wanton destruction by the use of disease. The Europeans introduced a variety of new diseases that Africans and Aborigines and people in the Caribbean had never experienced before. Smallpox, as you all know from the North American experience with the smallpox blankets which were given to the Native Americans. Smallpox became an instrument of genocide and destruction. The same was true of syphilis. They blamed the so-called Indians in Hispaniola for giving them syphilis, but in fact, the only documented evidence we have about the spread of syphilis is that syphilis moved around the world in the wake of European expansion. Wherever Europeans went, they took syphilis. If you trace the history of syphilis around the world, you find you can trace the history of syphilis around the world by looking at when the Europeans, quote unquote, discovered any particular area. If the Europeans got to Senegal in 1505, well, that's when syphilis came to Senegal. And if they got to Nigeria in 1506, that's when syphilis first appears in Nigeria. And if they got to South Africa in 1511, that marks the beginning of syphilis in South Africa. Everywhere that the Europeans went, syphilis was originally named after whichever kind of European brought it to them. In some places, syphilis was a French disease because the Frenchmen brought it to them. In some places, it was the English disease because it was the English who brought it to them. In some other areas, it was the Portuguese disease and so on. And in the case of syphilis, you have a most bizarre and alarming parallel in the history of AIDS in the last few years. Syphilis in the 1500s was the AIDS of that period in time. As the Europeans moved around the world destroying, yes, there were collaborators from among the conquered people. Yes, there were African collaborators. But don't for a minute believe, as some have tried to argue recently, that somehow the African traitors who collaborated with the white Jews and Gentiles were somehow equal in guilt to those who brought slavery and destruction to their land. Every struggle in the history of the world has always had its collaborators, its traitors. During the Second World War, you had people they called Quislings in Europe, Norway, elsewhere, who collaborated with the Nazis. During the Second World War, you had Zionists, Jews, Zionists, who collaborated with the Nazis. During the American War of Independence, you had Americans who collaborated with the British. Jesus Christ had his Judas. So collaboration is nothing new. But collaboration does not make the primary responsibility. The collaborators themselves were nothing but secondary factors in a destruction which was engineered out of Europe. Out of all these factors came the slave trade. The slave trade was the real crux of our particular Holocaust. Slavery and the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, which brought us here to the Americas. One of the major means of genocide by which the Europeans perpetrated the slave trade was by rationalizing the slave trade. It's very interesting, but even though the slave trade was a physical thing, which involved the total physical destruction of hundreds of millions of our people, an important part of that genocidal destruction has to do with the intellectual pretexts, the excuses, the rationales that the Europeans came up with. Before the Europeans killed us, they felt it necessary to justify what they were doing. For a while, they just justified our enslavement by saying that we were not Christian, we were heathens. Some of the Roman Catholics began Christianizing the slaves, so it became impossible to argue that we were not Christians, and that was the reason. So they looked at other pretexts to justify their genocide. Sooner or later, they came to the pretext that we weren't human. Thomas Jefferson, the great founding father, he wrote a book called Notes on the State of Virginia in the 1700s, in which he argued that Africans were less than human. Hence, they should be justifiably enslaved. Most of the major intellectual figures in Europe said the same thing. Hegel, great German philosopher, a whole bunch of them said the same thing. Africans were less than human, therefore they could justifiably be enslaved. In other words, they were setting up an intellectual justification for genocide. The most pernicious of all of these intellectual justifications for genocide was what they came to call the Hamitic myth. The idea that somehow we were cursed by God himself. That God himself had ordained that Africans would always be slaves. And the blame for this Hamitic myth, which ultimately resulted in the death of maybe 300 million or more of our people, lies with the Jewish rabbis, the people who invented the Talmud. The so-called Talmudic sages, the people who put together that most holy of Jewish books. It was in the Talmud, the so-called Babylonian Talmud, 1,000 years before the African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, that is. 1,000 years, 300-400 AD, that is when the Jewish rabbis, so-called sages, invented the Hamitic myth, put the curse of God on Africans. And that was the myth, 1,000 years later, which was revived by Jew and Gentile slaveholder alike. And that myth became the basis, the intellectual basis for the destruction of maybe 300 million or more of our people.
That's right.
The Hamitic myth came out of the book of Genesis in the Bible. The book of Genesis claimed that Noah had gotten drunk in his tent. His son Ham had looked upon him in his nakedness. Noah supposedly came to eventually and cursed Ham's son Canaan and his children after him for having gazed upon Noah in his nakedness. And there the story ended in the book of Genesis. It was the Jewish sages who then injected a racial component and somehow invented the fact that Ham somehow was the first African, and that the curse on Ham in the Bible therefore was a curse on Africans, and it was this curse then which became the justification, the intellectual underpinning for our Holocaust.
That's right. That's right.
There are many sources for this information, but the source that I like to quote is one which I quoted here in my book, The Jewish Onslaught, and I'm going to read it for you from the Jewish scholar Harold D. Brackman. Brackman has been going around the country of late, writing letters to the New York Times. I even saw a letter of his in the black press and all, saying that people like myself are misquoting him. Brackman made the mistake of writing a PhD dissertation in 1977 from UCLA. His dissertation is called The Ebb and Flow of History. It's a study of black-Jewish relations up to 1900. The arrogance and intolerance and ignorance of people who oppress us is absolutely amazing sometimes. They feel that they can write things in their books for their own consumption, but they underestimate our intelligence to such an extent that somehow when they write this foolishness in their books, they figure we will never have the sense to go and read their books and quote them. And of course, when we quote them, and when they realize to their great consternation that not only can we read and write, but we are a million times smarter than they are, because let's face it, the intellectual superiority claimed by those who oppress us is nothing but a big bubble. And we are fortunate enough to be living in a time when that bubble is being comprehensively burst. And that's the reason for the hysteria and the madness that we are seeing in the press every day today. That's the reason why day after day in the major media you can see Jewish columnists saying that Jews never enslaved Africans, when the record is so clear, so well documented by their own historians. Why would supposedly intelligent people paint themselves in a corner? Why would they deny the undeniable, when the evidence to the contrary is so plain for all to see? The reason is because they have underestimated us to such a degree that now that they are faced with the wrath of black intellectuals, they are forced into hysteria. Let me quote Brackman for you, and I don't care what he wrote in the New York Times, it's incredible. The ability of these folks to tell lies is absolutely amazing. Amazing, totally amazing. Sometimes I think that they are totally incapable of telling the truth. Sometimes I think that if the truth hit them in the head, they wouldn't even know what it was. Let me quote Brackman, sorry. Not Blackman, Brackman. No way he could ever be a black man. Actually, let me quote myself first in a paragraph before I quote Brackman. Here's what I said when I wrote this book. I said, Brackman probably considers his own PhD dissertation, quote unquote, hate propaganda by now. Let me go on to quote Brackman himself. Quote, "There is no denying," this is Brackman now, "there is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic, that is a black-hating, a Negrophobic content into the episode." He is talking here about the curse of Noah, curse of Ham by Noah in the book of Genesis. He is saying that the Babylonian Talmud, the first, if any of you can get a hold of the letter that Brackman wrote to the various papers, go back and read it and you'll see where he is totally contradicting what he himself is saying here. He is saying here, this is Brackman now, that the Babylonian Talmud, the holy book of the Jews, is the first. There's no qualification. He didn't say one of the first, without qualification, source to inject this racist foolishness into the curse of Ham's story. He goes on to say, and here is where it begins to get really hot and heavy. Brackman goes on to say that some of these Jewish so-called sages began to embellish the story as they went along and add little frills and details. Some of them began to say that black folks became black and ugly because of this curse. Black folk got thick lips because of the curse. And black folk got bulging eyes because of this curse. Black folk got black skin because of the curse. According to Brackman, and I know people always think I'm going insane when I say this, but I'm going to quote it for you in a hurry before you think I'm going insane. But according to Brackman, these Jewish rabbinical sages even went so far as to say that black men got long penises because of this curse. This is the holy book of the Jews now. Talmud. Quote, and here I'm quoting Brackman, and again, this is the intellectual basis upon which the annihilation of 300 million or more of our people rests. This is the pretext upon which the slave trade was built. Let me quote Brackman, quote, "The more important version of the myth, that is the Hamitic myth, however, ingeniously ties in the origins of blackness and of other real and imagined Negroid traits with Noah's curse itself. According to it, that is according to this myth, Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly." That's the Talmud. Because Ham has abused Noah in the darkness of the night, his children, that's us, we are his children, according to this myth, will be born black and ugly. So that's the reason why we are black and ugly, because according to the Talmud, Noah cursed Ham, the African, and his children.
Yes, sir. Look at itself.
"Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes." So that's the origin of our kinky hair and red eyes. It's all there in the Talmud. "Because your lips jested at my exposure, there shall swell." So if you ever wondered why black folk has thick lips, there it is. And of course, the Talmud, like any good piece of literature, leaves the best for last. It leaves the punchline for last. And here comes the punchline. "And because you neglected my nakedness, they," that is the children of Ham, us, the males at least, "because you neglected my nakedness, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see." So there you have it, the origin of the long male African penis. It's all there in the Talmud. Could it be a question of jealousy, maybe? I don't know. I don't know, I'm just asking. A rhetorical question. So all of this then was the underpinning for the African slave trade, the worst Holocaust in history. The killings began in Africa itself. Lord knows how many millions of Africans died before they even reached the Atlantic Ocean. The historians tell us that sometimes Africans were marched 1,000 miles to the coast. They were held in slavery on the coast sometimes for months, waiting a full cargo for a slave ship. The historians tell us that the Middle Passage, when the Africans were shipped from West Africa to the Americas, North America, South America, Caribbean, wherever, historians estimate that perhaps 1/3 of the slaves who were still alive when they entered the ships died before they hit the Americas. 1/3, a mortality rate of 1/3. You have horror stories of slaves being thrown overboard. There's a famous case concerning a ship called the Zong, where in order to forge an insurance claim, a ship actually threw the slaves overboard and then pretended they were captured by pirates or something and made a false insurance claim because the cargo was insured. Cargo. Even the terms they used, cargo. You had the beginnings of the rape of African women on the ships. J.A. Rogers tells us that on the slave ships, the sailors would improvise harems, rape the African women. Some of the women would arrive pregnant in the Americas and would therefore fetch more money because whoever bought them were buying two for the price of one. The slaughter, the Holocaust continued once the slaves hit the New World. C.L.R. James tells us that in Haiti, the average life expectancy for a slave who made it all the way to Haiti was 6 years. It was economically more viable for the slave master to work the slave to death in 6 years rather than treat the slave well, keep him or her to a ripe old age. You know, economists operate, they draw charts and diagrams and graphs and stuff. And they figured that if they worked the slave to the maximum and had the slave die in 6 years, it would be economically better for them. They would make more profits than if they let the slave live a normal life, sleep 8 hours a night, etc., live to an old age. Because once the slave lived to the old age, of course, then the slave became a charge on the slave plantation. You know, the slave owner would have to maintain the slave beyond the capacity of the slave to work. The tortures which were visited upon our people are absolutely amazing. We all know that the whip was the normal accompaniment of the workday of the slaves. Slaves were whipped 100 times, 200 times, 300 times. Slaves were made to walk around with special collars with prongs sticking out. The idea being that they could not sleep. You had this collar around your neck with prongs sticking out. So there was no way you could find a comfortable position to sleep. You know, no matter how you lay down, you know, you'd be in an awkward position. Your neck would be sore and stiff. Slaves were castrated as punishment. Slaves were dismembered, had their limbs cut off, ears cut off, noses, lips cut off. Slaves were branded like animals. Slaves were often denied the right to get married, raise a family. C.L.R. James tells us of a way of destroying slaves in Haiti called burning a little powder in the ass of a nigger, where they would stuff gunpowder into the anus of a slave and blow him up. J.G. Stedman, a British writer who went to Suriname in South America in the late 1700s, he wrote about what he saw there. He saw slaves and he actually drew diagrams, pictures. He wrote about slaves being drawn and quartered, tied to a large wooden structure and having all the bones broken with a heavy piece of iron or wood or something. The slave would be stretched out on this rack, wooden rack, and somebody would come and literally break all of the slave's bones. There's a picture drawn from life in Stedman's book, narrative of a 5-year expedition against the revolted Negroes of Suriname. He has a picture of a slave who was hung up from a gibbet with a hook, with a chain hanging down and a hook through his ribs. His hands tied behind his back, and he was left there to hang by his ribs until he died. He lay there for about a week. Stedman tells us about a large Jewish settlement in Suriname, a place called Jew Savannah, where the Jews proliferated as slaveholders. Stedman says the Jews in Suriname were the most cruel and wicked of all of the slaveholders. He talks about a Jewish woman who ran a red-hot poker through a slave woman and killed her. Red-hot poker. Stedman tells us about a Jewish slave owner called Schultz, who raped the mother of a young slave called Jolly Care. And the rape of mothers was a frequent occurrence in slavery, not only in Suriname, but everywhere that slavery existed. If you've ever wondered why the word motherfucker has become such a a term of scorn in our community. That's the reason why. Many a young slave child had to witness, because the slaves lived in little one-room cabins, and when the slave master came to rape his mother in the night, there was no privacy. Many a young slave child had to witness his mother being raped by some slave owner. And here you had this Jewish slave owner named Schultz. And Stedman tells us that Jolly Care as a child witnessed his mother being raped by this slave owner. Jolly Care grew up to become a leader of the Maroons in Suriname, who waged successful war against the white people. And as fate would have it, the time came when Jolly Care grew up to become the leader of rebellious slaves, and he was waging war against the slave owners, and he captured the same Schultz, captured him, the man who had raped his mother. And Schultz told Jolly Care, well, look, man, I remember you as a kid, you grew up on my plantation. I know you're not going to kill me now. We have a special relationship. I was good to you. And according to Stedman, Jolly Care cut off Schultz's head. He cut his head off, and he played bowls. You know, he went bowling with it on the beach. According to Stedman, Jolly Care then flayed Schultz, cut the skin off his back, and used it to keep his powder dry in his cannon. So that was at least one motherfucker who fought his just deserts. So who ran the slave trade? Who perpetrated these atrocities against our people? Who committed this Holocaust against our people? Yes, we know that Arabs were involved in the slave trade. Not so much the transatlantic slave trade, more the slave trade to the east, but slave trade all the same. Yes, we know that Christians were involved in the slave trade. I don't think there's a Christian denomination that wasn't involved in the slave trade. Yeah, we know the Pope was involved. We know there were Jesuit priests in Brazil who had harems of slave women like anybody else. The fact is, however, that as far as I know, none of these people deny their involvement in the slave trade. The only people who deny their involvement in the slave trade and get indignant when you remind them of it is the Jewish element. And if I single out the Jews, it's because they have attempted to deny the undeniable. We are told that in the days of slavery, even though the Christians were the ones who perpetrated the slave trade to a large degree in this country, at the very least, they were heavily represented among the abolitionist societies. We are told that the Jews as Jews were few and far between as far as the abolitionist movement goes. And now that we as African scholars are trying to set the historical record right, we again run into the problem where it is the Jewish scholars and activists and columnists in the major newspapers, they're the ones who have sought to deny their involvement in our slave trade. And their involvement, as I said earlier, is well documented. The largest slave ship owner in this country was Aaron Lopez, a Sephardic Jew. That's right, Newport, Rhode Island. The second in command of the Confederacy was a Jew, Judah Benjamin, as were many of the leading members of the Confederacy. Some of the major shareholders, stockholders in the Dutch West India Company, major multinational corporation financing the slave trade with Jews. A large number of the slave ship owners, the Portuguese slave ship owners who brought slaves to the Americas were Jews. David Brinkley, and this week with David Brinkley a few months ago, discussing my case at Wellesley College, was talking some foolishness there one Sunday morning. He was saying that Tony Martin was anti-Semite at Wellesley. He's talking foolishness. He was saying that Tony Martin is saying that the Jews brought slaves to the Americas. And David Brinkley said, he is wrong. It wasn't the Jews, it was the Portuguese. But the damn fool didn't know that it was the Portuguese Jews. They were one and the same. The results of this Holocaust in the New World are plain to see. As early as the early 1800s, African Americans were almost 20% of the population in this country. Today, African Americans are something like 12% or thereabouts. Black folk have actually declined as a percentage for a variety of reasons. Part of it is the continuing Holocaust. Part of it is the infusion of a lot of European immigrants to try and swamp the black population. And that continuing Holocaust has continued unabated even after slavery. In Africa itself, people forget that even in Africa itself, after slavery ended, the Holocaust continued as though slavery had never ended. In fact, it became worse in many areas.
That's right.
In the country they call the Belgian Congo, now Zaire, between 1880 and 1900, the Belgians killed about 12 to 20 million Africans in that one little country, the Belgian Congo. Where's the Holocaust Museum to those 12 to 20 million Africans killed in that one country in 20 years? In this country, we had the incredible phenomenon of lynching. From the time the Civil War ended up until fairly recently, a few decades ago, almost every single day in this country, black men, women, and children were lynched. They were burnt at the stake. I saw the photograph, as many of you saw, Brother Khalid here, in the papers this morning, with a poster of a black man being burnt at the stake. Black men, women, and children were hung from trees, from lampposts. I'll never forget the headline I saw of a Mississippi newspaper from 1919. It said, 3,000 will lynch Negro tomorrow. That was the headline. The governor of the state, Governor Bilbo, said he was powerless to stop it. That was the will of the people. What did Europe benefit from our Holocaust? The reason why Europe is preeminent in the world today, economically, militarily, is precisely because of our Holocaust. Europe's ascendancy in the world today was literally built on the blood, sweat, and tears of Africans. Eric Williams, in his famous book, Capitalism and Slavery, showed in minute detail how all of the profits that went to finance the Industrial Revolution came out of the super profits made in trading slaves and growing slave-grown sugar, cotton, and so on. The slave trade is what made Europe preeminent from the 18th century on, and Europe maintains its preeminence today because of our suffering. That's the reason why we call for reparations today. What did Europe gain from the slave trade? Europe gained raw materials. It gained a dumping ground to send its misfits. Georgia was a penal colony. Georgia was settled by convicts out of England. Australia was settled by convicts out of England. The West Indies, Columbus's first voyage, was nothing but convicts, people on death row. Those were the people who were on the ships. One of the most amazing efforts of Europe to dump its problems on us arose in this century around the effort to find a homeland for the Jews. For many years before they finally came up with Palestine, they were looking around the world and they seriously considered Uganda as a place to dump the Jews. They seriously considered Kenya. As late as the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, when the Second World War began in 1939, there was actually a Jewish delegation in what was then British Guyana in South America. And they were getting ready, in fact they wrote a report, and they were getting ready to dump the Jews in British Guyana. If the Second World War didn't start when it did, who knows? Instead of Palestine today, it might have been Guyana. They had maps drawn where they cut Guyana in half, and they were going to give half to the Jews. So every time you see what's happening in Palestine today, you can breathe a sigh of relief and say, there, but for the grace of God, go us. Did Africans resist? Of course Africans resisted. As I said before, the reason why we have survived is precisely because we resisted. Jolly Care resisted. Nat Turner resisted. And very often it was those slaves who had some education, who had what in the eyes of the white slave owners would have seemed privilege. Those were the slaves very often who made the sacrifice to make common cause with their less fortunate brethren. Denmark Vesey, who led one of the largest, most powerful slave conspiracies in America, was a free man. He was a free man. He put his freedom and his life on the line to go back and raise the slaves. David Walker, who wrote the most powerful indictment against slavery, was a free man in Boston, paid with his life. Nat Turner was able to read and write. He was a literate slave, one of the few literate slaves. When Nat Turner got his little group together, there was a man with him that his confessions, so-called, called Will. Will the executioner. And Nat said to Will, why do you come here? Why do you come here? And Will said, you know, my life isn't any more dear to me than anybody else's. I'm going to strike a blow for freedom. Will the executioner. And whenever Nat himself was faltering and hesitant, it was always Will who came up behind and struck the fatal blow. In fact, in the confessions, they refer to him as Will, the executioner, with his fatal axe. When Nat...
Amen. Amen.
When Nat Turner was eventually caught, put in jail, tried, sentenced to death, a white man named Thomas Gray went and interviewed Nat Turner in the jail. And in the middle of the confessions, which this white man wrote down, it's very fascinating, but this white man, Thomas Gray, he's in the middle of these confessions, he is writing down Nat Turner's account of what happened, and he pauses and he says, I looked at Nat and I saw this black man there, you know, in rags, fettered, getting ready to die. And I saw the resolute power in his eyes, the lack of repentance. And Thomas Gray, the white man, he said, my blood curdled within me. That was the power of not even getting ready to die. The power of resolution, of truth, that revolutionary zeal. And Thomas Gray asked Nat, he said to Nat, aren't you sorry for what you did? They're going to kill you, they're going to hang you tomorrow. And Nat's response was not Jesus Christ crucified? Liberty or death is what Nat is talking about. Finally, let me endorse the call for reparations. Our people have suffered too much. Everybody else has gotten their reparations. As of 1985, the Jews had gotten at least $70 billion worth of reparations. $70 billion worth of reparations from Germany. And that didn't include all the billions of free grants and aid that the US government gives them every year. And that didn't include the back reparations that they paid for East Germany when East Germany ceased to be communist. So Lord knows what the figure is today. It must be well over $100 billion by today. And the great irony is that the same people who had gotten perhaps $100 billion worth of reparations for their 6 million, those were the same people who turned around and went to extraordinary lengths to prevent black people getting even the most measly, embryonic reparations. They were the people who went and entered the Baki court case, the Supreme Court case back in 1977, the Baki case. The Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League. I prefer to call them the Defamation League because that's all they do. The ADL and the other Jewish organizations, they went out of their way in a case that did not concern them. They filed what the lawyers call Friends of the Court briefs to argue against affirmative action quotas for black people. Here were people who had gotten perhaps $100 billion, not million, but $1 billion worth of reparations, going to extraordinary lengths to prevent African Americans from getting 2 or 3 places in a medical school by way of reparations. So clearly, justice is on our side. Like I say, we live in a very exciting time. We live in a time now where we have conquered fear. We live in a time, I believe, when, as James Brown used to say back in the 1960s, you remember he had a song, Say It Loud, I'm black and I'm proud. Say it loud. In that song, James Brown says that we demand a share. So we are at the point now where we demand a share. We are at a point now where we are no longer afraid. We are at a point now where we have buried or are in the process of burying Uncle Tom. Our liberation is at hand. The 21st century belongs to us. So let the Jews and the Gentiles rage. It doesn't matter. Yes, sir. One God, one aim, one destiny. Thank you very much.
Give it up again. Dr. Tony Martin. All right, all praises to you. Brothers and sisters, How many of you all feel that this is a good event for the university and the community? Put your hands up, and this is a good event for the community. How many of you students we got here, huh? All right. Well, we're happy that y'all came out. How many of y'all want me to stop organizing? How many of y'all want me to keep organizing? What we got to do now is there are 1,500 seats here, but yet there are only 1,300 people in here. So we're going to try to move certain, if we have knowledge of some people outside who want to get in and hear the lecture. So if those who are over there on that end could move as far over as you can. I know I've done this before. Move over, please. So we can make room for our brothers and sisters. How many people sit next to an empty seat in the house tonight? Okay, that's at least 100 at the very minimum. That's at least 100. Okay, brothers and sisters, I know some of you are hungry, but we're gonna feed first for about 15 minutes from one of our best brothers. He wasn't scared on the flyer, but we know him very well. Who is it? His name is his name. Back in November, we had a program, a tribute to the real revolutionaries. Brother Steve wasn't able to make it. But we gave him an award for revolutionary research science. And for the next 15 minutes, then we'll have intermission for about 10 or 15 minutes. Then we'll come back and hear from our esteemed brother, Dr. Jefferies and Dr. Collins. How many of y'all gonna be with us all night? We're going to the Ritz all night. We're going to the party all night. We're going to feed on knowledge all night. Don't feel bad about what's happening tonight, brothers. One thing that I did admire about going to the Jewish Holocaust Museum is you don't tell them how to honor their suffering and their dead. They do it, they honor their suffering and their dead, and you don't tell them nothing about it. We don't have a museum, but we do have the Black Holocaust program tonight. And we're proud of what we're doing tonight in commemoration of our ancestors. Let's bring on the name drop. The man who speaks. Revolutionary research scientist. Steve Oakley.
I'm gonna do it this way. How you doing? All right? I'm pushing that mouth. All right. I appreciate you, brothers and sisters. Hotep. I'm very honored to have a few minutes just to share a little information with you to hopefully I can advance the reason why we're here tonight. I especially want to thank Brother Khalid for extending himself out to me today. I'm honored for the invitation. I appreciate being amongst such good brothers and sisters. I also see as well in the audience many other outstanding brothers and sisters who on any other night would equally be as honored and as shared. I see Sister Nana Shishibi there from the Pan-African Congress. Yeah. I see Sister Mary Cox out there, attorney and freedom fighter. I see Sister Deborah 2X was down here from Baltimore. I see Brother Elder Yehuda out there. I know Brother Eric is here from the Research Brothers and Sisters from New York. Brother Steve is here from Dallas. There's people here from all the way from Los Angeles. I really appreciate the opportunity as the focus is geared towards the Black Holocaust. And of course, whenever you have a murder, you must have a murderer. There must be someone who does the murder. So now that we're looking at what was a dead body that is resurrected, we must now find out who tried to put it in a comatose state. For what you will find in all of the people who have come to stand before you as warriors, and those of you who are warriors in your own right, it is our goal to pursue the core of negativity. We have agreed that somewhere at the bottom of our problem there is a core or a main group of key individuals and institutions and organizations who have pulled off consecutively over the years negative activity against our people without retribution. Part of the failure to retribute has been lack of knowledge. Part of what Brother Malik has tried to do here today is to fill the gap and to provide our people with access to information that is denied. I think what each of these men could vouch for in their moments of greatest attack from the enemy, that in the midst of all the greatest sources, I remember Dr. Jefferies on the Donahue show pulling up every book of the hunkies he could find to relay that he didn't need dogma or rumor from the black community to verify what was being done to us. They had, in their own arrogance and braggadocious nature, they had said all the things we needed to say, and the brother stood there with the evidence. And I remember Brother Tony Martin standing moment after moment bringing up the names of those people, institutions, historically and current, in his attack on the people who have attacked him. And he knows there was a point when they looked at him and said, you know, it really ain't about the facts. You see, what you have witnessed in the spirit of the scholar, because it alleged that we lacked the knowledge or the information of the fingers on the points of the people who were doing it, was that when the scholars arose with the information, they and I and others found out that they really weren't interested in the truth. It was bigger than that. Just we took the gray area out of the attack and found out that their attack wasn't based on fact. They were, in fact, the haters they were calling us. I recently had the honor of just leaving the University of Illinois, where I went back for free to retaliate against whites who had attacked me. I don't very often talk to whites. I do not talk to the media. I do not entertain some of the ones I see here today. And as a strategy, one of our cameras must get a picture of all those who are here to take pictures of us. That must happen. We must have always accessible the pictures and the profiles. When Dr. Collard pointed out that Richard Cohen was in the front row, that's when he left. Finger pointing and naming the names does have a way of moving the enemy. So I had the honor, after spending 2-3 hours of dropping Carol Quigley and talking about the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberger Group and the Skull and Bones and the Rhodes Scholars and the Boule, the little Jewish students the next day went to the newspaper and said that Coakley must have got his information out of Mein Kampf. But no, those were good white scholars because, as I've always said, because we've been so indoctrinated, we know it takes a good white scholar to prove to our people that the truth is the truth. Us saying it has never been enough, and we bore that burden in spite of that, and still it wasn't the facts. So if it isn't the facts, then it must be the force. I salute you in the spirit of the Bogard, because the facts will back up the rationale, but it'll be the Bogard that will put it in force. I'm on just quickly tonight to try to add a few names and a few insights. I'll be here again on June 3rd with the trial of the oath takers. I've chosen to attack the oath takers because as I've gone from city to city and attacked the Greek connection, I found out that there were oaths and rituals that people absolved their faith to and support that prohibited them from being ultimately loyal to black people. These oath takers are really not personal, they're institutional. And the Army takes an oath, the lawyers take an oath, the doctors take an oath. These oaths, and only in rare case like a good lawyer like Mary Cox and a strong doctor like Dr. Alim, who would break the oath to defend their people first and foremost. These are rare moments in our community, but the oath takers are a part of our enemy structure. I know Dr. Collard isn't here now, so I'm going to save my opening for the close because it's something very personal for him. As I began to come out of college and fight against, I always wanted to be a freedom fighter. You know, there's no spot in our community called freedom fighter. And everybody, if you ask them if they had the choice, if they could fight for their people all day and all night, that this would be one of the most honorable things a person of our race would want. But there is no position called freedom fighter, for the right to fight for black people is something that you have to do, as some would want you to think, after you got through working for someone else. But time has passed and the way has been made that more people have come across on their own. But when I first started out in the black community in Chicago, I was offered a job at an organization. It was called the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. It was headed by a white man named Milt Cohen, who recently died, and a white woman who is still active in Chicago named Jane Ramsey. I say that because every time we say a name in front of the hunkies who are here to report on what we say, tomorrow they will report to those people that their names were mentioned, and this is the type of tension we need to put on the enemy. You might not know all who they are, but they'll spend some time defending them tomorrow when we've called their names in front of you. So that will make the offense spend some time defending the things that they have come to offend us about. But what I found out was that the black community in Chicago was being watched. That the only way you could effectively pull off a Holocaust on a group of people in the now society is to try to watch the emergings of them, the organizing and coming together of them, the projection of values and strength by them. Those are the things that the enemy sticks his thermometer deep down into our tongues and up our butts to find out when it is and what it is they think they can pull off. In Chicago, I found this early warning system. It was funded by the United Way. So today I suggest to you, if you're going to stop the black Holocaust, you're going to have to stop the good hands of the United Way. I say that because, and listen, I'm going fast, so we don't have no time for applause. I bring the United Way up because it was the United Way that formed an early warning system, which is what the spy thing is called, an early warning system. Our eyes and ears are listening post, these adjectives. And this early warning system had formed a coalition which was to monitor what was going on in the black community of Chicago. And they went out and empowered 25 organizations to be snitches against the wishes of black people. And even though the goal of this project was to monitor developing racial tension and to take advanced intervention when necessary, listen to the language, they only watched black people. But deep inside the early warning system, I saw people from the Urban League. I saw people from the NAACP. I saw Operation Push. I saw the United Church of Christ. I saw many people who I got slightly confused by because I didn't understand why any $18, $20, $30, $50, or $100,000 was worth a person crossing their own people unless they felt that their own people didn't know enough about how they did the damn spying to fear the people catching them. So I started off with a little 2-page document that started to describe how the Anti-Defamation League, and this is, I found them in '79. They got caught in 1992, but I caught them in '79. It just took a long time for the people to believe that Brother Coakley was as credible as the district attorney in San Francisco. And each and every one of these brothers up there, I saw huge extensive profiles of Dr. Collett in that 900-page document that the white district attorney of San Francisco had to turn in to a black judge, to get the right to raid their offices. And when they asked them to raid the offices in Los Angeles to find where this information was duplicated and located, the black police chief wouldn't assume his own authority and transact the raid. They had to call in police from another district because the black man didn't want to defend the names that he saw in the list. And even though there were some whites in there, there were names of black people like those up here who wasn't worth him going to defend. Reason I say that is that we're pretty mad at the white guy, but the white guy we might not see to the last moment. In fact, I had this dream, this fantasy. We got Rockefeller over here, we got Oppenheimer over here, we got Rothschilds over there, and we got the noose right here. And the crimes that had been read out before the people. And I know it was a little white guy here from Australia. He said, "Are you Steve Coakley?" I said, "No, he went that way." But I turned to the brothers in the back I was talking to, and I said, "You see, that guy, he come over here from Australia because the reason he want to know is that his godfather is Harry, Ernest, and what's the other Oppenheimer? Harry Jr. Those are his godfathers. So when we stand up and say that the man who helped today enslave New Zealand and enslave Australia and enslave all of Africa is led by the Oppenheimer family, yes, they will come from the BBC and the CBC and the Australian news to hear that the names of the hunkies who have hidden for so long are now on the street in D.C. They're on the street in L.A. They're on the street in Kansas City and Detroit, and the little people have decided that the big ones are not going to make it. So I want to say a name or two so that the whites will go away and effectively spread the cancer to the others that we mention their name. Now, there was a case that the Anti-Defamation League had spied on the brothers and sisters, even 12,000 people in organizations. But what you don't know is how it was that the case was settled, that the Anti-Defamation League did not get criminally violated. There are some weird white people out here, and I want to tell the whites that there are whites who are leaking information about them every day to people who they believe have the courage to use it. And whites had made claim that the Anti-Defamation League of the United States works right through the National Security Council. And when I did a little check over at the National Security Council, and I remember when they said they were spying on Chris Hani when he came over here, and I tried to figure out what the connection was. Then I looked up and found that the head of the African desk of the National Security Council is a white man who's named David Steinberg. Now, David Steinberg's name ain't never been mentioned in the history of the black community since he done took that position. He know that. But today we introduce his name into the arena as a group of people whose names must never be forgotten, and you should take the time to look him up in your phone book so that you know where he lives, where Jim Woosley lives, who heads the CIA. Where does Warren Christopher live, who runs the State Department? The CIA jams Africa through the embassies in Africa, and that's where they hide the CIA. So Warren Christopher and the Deputy Secretary of State, Strong Talbot, and Peter Tarnoff, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who's the third in command at the State Department, those names should be in the forefront of you, as well as Winston Lord's name, as well as David Ross's name. And of course, I want to repeat again David Steinberg, because it was him who got the Anti-Defamation League out of that criminal case when they spied on other people. Two things I want to leave you with. One is on July 8th to July 15th, Brother Coakley is having a conference in Baltimore. And the reason he's having the conference in Baltimore is because it appears as if there was a mistake made by the Hyatt Regency Hotel in the harbor there, and it looks like Brother Coakley and the Boule, Sigma Pi Phi, are going to be having a convention at the same time, July 8th to July 15th in Baltimore, Maryland. Stop now, stop. Don't waste my time. And how many of you, since LA is coming, Detroit is coming, Chicago's coming, they have the furthest to come, it will cost them the most to get here, but the key to the bottom 10, for the first time in the history of our race, brothers, the bottom 10 is going to meet the top 10. And I know, I done drew out a lot of strange occurrences on this, because everybody don't want everybody to know how clear the top 10 works on behalf of protecting the honky. But we have resolved the riddle of their Grecian Sphinx, and now the day has come that the bottom 10 must confront the top 10 to protect the safety and sanctity of the race. This must happen. How many of you would be willing to come to the Hyatt Regency in Baltimore during this 10-day period? All right, stop. I'll be downstairs. I'm in a booth downstairs. We can talk about that. My tapes are down there, and the other vendors down there ask that we make sure that they know, that you know they're down there, and they need your support too. Last thing. It would be a great remiss if we didn't take our chance to put on the record that we wanted to enforce some retaliation against the enemy. And around this country, in fact, just 2 weekends ago here, the Republic of New Africa, which I was on a forum with, in fact, with Brother Chokwe Lumumba, they ratified a resolution that I proposed, which was for economic sanctions against non-black businesses for the months of November, December, and January. This must be. Now, I've been attacked right here in the black press for suggesting that in Washington by the Negro element in African clothes, but that's all right. Stop now. But I need you to understand that when the hunky walk away and he said, well, what did they say they were going to do? He writes it down. Sometimes that's the vaguest of all the lists. We must, and I ask you to ratify a resolution that calls for economic sanctions against non-black businesses for those 3 months, because that's the months that 60% of all goods are sold. And if we were ever to punish the whites, this is something anybody can do. All you got to do is hold your pockets. You don't even have to say nothing. You don't have to believe in it. You might not be spending nothing no way. At least take pride now in not being able to do it. So I hope all of you would be willing to do that, so that when they go away, they know it's some economic retaliation on the buffer. And in closing, The New York Times, almost a year ago today, April 18th, 1993, Sister Nana, openly advocated the recolonization of Africa, and I want to say fuck them just to that, because, stop, because the audacity of trying to draw question about our brother and his statements about Africa, when in fact you are on the record a year ago yesterday. Colonialism is back and not a moment too soon. Some countries are not yet fit to govern themselves, and then they end by saying, we gonna get Africa. So I know that, brother, you stepped on a wire of theirs that they didn't really want attention being focused on, but we want to let them know that we have not forgotten them, and that we know them with the Council on Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs, openly advocating a year ago today, we're gonna make Africa beg to be recolonized. I don't know if you know about the past Holocaust, but you better dig in and get ready against this now one. There's some now people who feel so arrogant and so alone that they can openly do this just with whites and think we're not listening. So we'll put the pressure on them. And one last thing. Brother Khaled, do you remember when we were in Atlanta at the Revolution 101 conference? And at that conference, we were sitting down and looking at the Anti-Defamation League's attack on black leaders. Brother Jefferies in there, Brother Martin will be in the next one, Brother Malik gonna be in the next one. But when we looked at that report, you looked at me and you said something that I mentioned to almost every audience I go to because it touched me personally. You said, brother, you were looking for your name. And you was looking and said, damn, I ain't got but 2 paragraphs. You know, we were talking. And no, he said something that was very heavy. He said, one day my son is going to look at me and say, Daddy, why you only got 2 paragraphs in the destruction of the enemy? And he looked at me and he said, brother, shit, I got to do better than this. He did. Well, brother, I know that Brother Malik and Brother Martin and Brother Jefferies and you too, Brother Khaled, you have made your sons and your daughters proud. You have earned your spurs against the enemy. Thank you.
Once again, Brother Steve. Amen. Well, we're going to take a 10-minute break for intermission. There's food, drinks, there are vendors downstairs.
It was in Baltimore, brother. And I called him up this morning.
You hear that Dr. Green got sick or had a heart? No. When was that? No, that was on me. That's not true.
Let's get ready now, brothers and sisters, to receive Dr. Leonard Jefferies. Are you ready to hear Dr. Leonard Jefferies? Do you love Dr. Leonard Jefferies? Is he one of our best? Is he one of our brightest? We challenge all the scholars of the world, all of the white scholars of the planet. Get them all, bring them all, and we'll take these 4 brothers with Steve Coakley. We'll take 5 of our best, and we'll take on all of the scholars that you have, and you will be defeated. So let's receive the chairman of the Black Studies Department of the City College of the City University of New York. It's New York in the house. It's New York in the house. When New York goes, the whole country's gonna go, because New York is the heartbeat of black America. And this man has withstood the attacks of our enemy. As a matter of fact, he got them for a $400,000 lawsuit as they tried to unjustly put him out of his chairman department. Now they had to pay him and reinstate him. Why? Because Dr. Leonard Jefferies stands on the truth. He's a soldier. He's a warrior. Let us receive our brother, our big brother, Dr. Leonard Jefferies.
Yeah. Hotep, brothers and sisters. Assalamu alaikum. It is indeed a pleasure to have flown all across the country. I left California this morning, landed at Dulles at 4 o'clock because I knew this would be a historic event. So I'm glad to see all of you here. Let's give a special acknowledgement for the brothers and sisters who worked so hard to make this a success, led by Brother Malik. As you know, we're in the middle of a historic battle that involves the struggle for the African mind. At the turn of the last century, W.E.B. Du Bois said the struggle of the 20th century was going to be the color line. And during this period, it has been just that. Our scholars, our leaders, our concerned and committed individuals have been now telling us as we march into the 21st century that the problem of the 21st century is going to be the African mind. Now that needs to be understood in terms of a double entente, a double meaning. The African mind in terms of our thinking, our intellectual ability, and the African mind, M-I-N-E, in terms of what is located in Mother Africa. The world is organizing itself for an enormous struggle, and the key to that struggle of a so-called new order is who controls the African thinking, the African mind, and who controls the African mind, M-I-N-E. Because as quiet as it's kept, high technology developed by Europeans and maintained by Asians and necessary for the 21st century has to have the mineral wealth of Africa in order for it to be successful. There are minerals in Africa that exist only in Africa and not in any other part of the world. So you have to understand the process of African Holocaust and genocide that was initiated 500 years ago continues. And that's why it's so important for our brothers and sisters to bring us together here to lay these things out. But of course, as we lay these things out, there's an enormous difficulty because the fear factor is abound. People who want to control the African mind, body, and spirit are operating under this enormous fear factor, and that's what the attack is all about on the individuals who've raised up and raised this truth about our people. You attack Jefferies, you attack Khalid Muhammad, you attack Brother Coakley, you attack Brother Tony Martin, and a host of others, not to instill fear in us, because as quiet as it's kept, we are fearless. We are fearless. We are prepared to give our all for our people. But the fear factor is put in place to instill fear in you, to instill fear in our young people who have to be prepared in a special way so they can be strong for the 21st century, to instill fear in our leadership. We've got to begin to understand that. And that's one of the major techniques of the system of white supremacy. So I'm very glad that we're here to support the brothers and sisters who called for Howard University to be a great institution. A university is supposed to be a place where the truth, issues, and concerns can be discussed. But as we've seen with the attacks, they try to close down the universities, and that is an attempt to close down your mind. And you have to understand how significant that is. But you've got to be strong. You've got to find the courage. You've got to tap into your African spirituality. Frederick Douglass said, having fought his way out of enslavement, having beat back his slave masters, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Let me say it again. Frederick Douglass left us with these important words, which we need to digest and make a part of our being. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men who want the crops without plowing up the ground. They want the rain without the thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice which will be imposed upon them, and these will continue until they are resisted with either words or blows or both. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. If you accept your oppression, it will continue. So clearly the words of Frederick Douglass needs to be in our hearts, and we're in the city where Frederick Douglass' spirit was. We're standing in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial. But if we want an emancipator, we need to look among our people. We need to look to the Frederick Douglass, the Harriet Tubmans, your great-grandparents and mine, who fought for liberty and liberation in this land. Another of our great speakers and thinkers and spirits, Malik Shabazz. Left us with this empowering concept that as you struggle for your liberation, you are duty-bound. God forces you, Allah commands that you liberate yourself by any means necessary. Isn't it a joke that the oppressor wants to tell you where and when to enter and to deal with his oppression? But we are in a new day. We are dealing with a serious understanding of African knowledge and power. Dr. Wade Nobles laid down for us a dictum which you need to understand. Power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition as if it was their own. Let me say it again. We got to teach here tonight. This is Howard University. Howard, where the spirit of Leo Hansberry roams these halls, where the spirit of some of our greats that went before us, like Chancellor Williams, roams these halls. This is not just a site for Negro nests. There's been some serious Africans that have come through Howard University. At one point, they had our sister, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, in these hallowed halls. Her spirit is still here. Dr. Wade said, power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. And that's the name of this game. Africans with their critical minds have defined our reality, and other people are now responding to it as if it were their own. They're checking every word we say. They're even checking when we go to the men's room to see what our stool process was. We have now redefined reality, and that's real power. We don't have any atomic weaponry, but we have this power, this knowledge. It used to be that the European talked about the third world. That was him. And then he had a third world. He had a first world, which was him, and a third world, which was us. We accepted this definition of power. Never even critically asked what was the second world. We just jumped ourselves into the third world. But now African knowledge and African minds and African courage and African spirituality is redefining the reality. And we know with science and history that we are the first world, and we don't care what comes behind us. And as we define the first world with the scientific knowledge and understanding, that is available to us. We're talking about Africa, the mother of culture and civilization. Africa, the birthplace of humanity. We've redefined the world. The European had a paradigm which we accepted uncritically. Not only did he call himself the first world and dump us in the third world, but he talked about there were the haves and the have-nots. The haves were Europeans. Even the most poor European could think of himself as a have. And the have-nots were people of color, the melanized people on the planet Earth, who have all the gold, the diamonds, uranium, the platinum, titanium, the oil, but we're the have-nots. But with our critical minds, as we march into the 21st century, we redefined our reality. We know that we are the haves on planet Earth, and that's why people have structured systems to try to come at us. We have to be prepared. You have to get serious. As we travel around the country, we tell our people, don't get mad, get glad. Don't be sad, be prepared. Forget about the looks and get into the books. And don't worry about the behind, get into your African mind. It's time for us to take upon ourselves this sacred responsibility, because we have to prepare for the future. One of our great young warriors, the Malcolm X of his generation in Southern Africa, Steve Biko. Left us with these words, and I'm trying to lay down for you words of empowerment. These concepts. Steve Biko said, the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Let me say it again. The greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. This was an important statement I had to underline in a book I wrote on the struggle in South Africa, edited in 1983 when I went to the World Council of Churches to try to get support for the struggle in South Africa. And it was clear that this brother, with the women of South Africa, symbolized by Winnie Mandela, and the children of South Africa, who were ready to give their life to have their minds free of the taint of Afrikanism, the Dutch Boer language and culture. Young children died in 1976 to be free of this poison of white supremacy. That's why it's important for you and for me to understand that mind control is the name of the game. And it is that which supports and sustains the system of white supremacy. So if we have some charges to be made against people who call themselves our friends, against people who claim they marched with us in the civil rights movement, against people who claim that they funded all of our activities, we need to understand what that means in terms of their control over what we think and what we do. It's a new day, and we're arming ourselves to destroy this mind control that has been imposed upon us. Mind control that has been institutionalized in the culture of this nation and around the Western world, and as quiet as it's kept the African world. It's in the Caribbean where our people are. It's in Brazil where our people are. In South America, Guyana where our people are. It's in Africa. European mind control. And that's why we've been struggling in the educational arena for a curriculum of liberation that deals with our truth. And that's why they've been coming at us. But we have to live by the truth. We can't live a lie. We have to live by the truth, and we have to be prepared to fight to support that truth. We have to be prepared to give our lives for that truth, because that's why we're here. We have to understand that on the shoulders of people who gave their lives, we've been able to make it through to today. We have not made it through to today because of some founding father slave masters whose monuments are here in Washington. I'm talking about George. I'm talking about Thomas. I'm talking about all of them. Founding father slave masters. You have to put a critical analysis to the experience and come up with your reality. And even though there's a memorial to Abraham Lincoln, he did not emancipate a soul. If you want a white emancipator, find Charles Sumner's spirit and link up with that senator who was prepared to give his life and was caned down on the floor of the Senate because he was raising questions of our interests. Find the Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. If you need a white man, find someone who was prepared to stand up for us. But the ultimate of white liberation, if you need it, is John Brown, who gave his life for what he felt was a principled struggle. And then be sophisticated. This is a university now. Be sophisticated when you apply the John Brown test to white folks. And that's my advice to you. If you got to have some white partners, apply the John Brown test. But then you got to be smart and sophisticated and understand what John Brown you're talking about. Because in the history, there are a couple of key John Browns. In the Revolutionary era, you had a John Brown. That John Brown was a part of the family of Browns that helped to fund Brown University, an elite Protestant family that was involved totally and completely in the enslavement Holocaust of African peoples. Slavers in New England, where the Puritans were supposed to be. Slavers in New England, where all of this liberty and justice in Plymouth Rock was supposed to be. The John Brown family. Most of the Brown brothers got a crisis of conscience and decided to step out of slavery after they had gotten filthy rich on our death and destruction. But one of the brothers refused to have a conscience, refused to get out of enslavement, and his name was John Brown. And he stayed in enslavement until he died, involved in the African Holocaust. So you need to apply the analysis of which John Brown are you talking about? The John Brown who refuses to give up the exploitation of African peoples, or the John Brown who is ready to rally not only himself but his own family in the cause of the struggle. Have a systems analysis, brothers and sisters. Let's not get a paralysis of analysis. But if you're going to liberate yourselves, you've got to have yourselves as the major focus. We're not waiting for white liberators to deal with African peoples. We've got to do it ourselves. So remember, as Brother Steve laid down, the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the minds of the oppressed. So we've got to free our African minds. And there is a process of freedom that we've tapped into. That's why these brothers and sisters are so strong that you've seen around the country. It's a new day.
That's right. That's right.
We've tapped into the power of this struggle and legacy our people have laid down for us.
Yes, sir.
Even when we use their institutions to struggle against them, we've tapped into this power. I declared a couple of years ago at an honors convocation at the City College that I was bringing the most important and significant lawsuit in the history of the American Academy against the violation of my First Amendment rights. We promised it in '92. By '93, we had the team of lawyers that was in the courtroom of the federal court in New York, laying down as best African lawyers could the case for our freedom. These lawyers were so brilliant, the males and the females. They've changed the image of Africans struggling for their liberation. That trial was on court TV, and 20 to 30 million people saw it around the country, the Caribbean, and in Europe. And they saw the African mind and spirit at work. But they saw the system of white supremacy at work, trying to drag us down, trying to deny us rights that we fought for and died for in this nation to make real for all peoples. So that struggle continues. And even though Dr. J was on the cover of Emerge magazine, the brothers that have taken over Emerge, the new team of people, try to make up for that attack on us 2 years ago that included an attack on Francis Cress Welsing. So the March issue had Dr. J on the cover, entitled Dr. Jefferies' Revenge, and that he is $400,000 richer. They miscalculated. We are millions of dollars richer because the level of this struggle that I have been exposed to, and seeing our young people around the country stand up, and seeing our young people in the Caribbean stand up, and seeing our young people in Brazil stand up, and seeing our young people in England stand up, and seeing our young people in Africa stand up. That's a multi-billion-dollar award that I've received. As I came into Washington, I called the lawyer, and I understand that the appellate court has ruled in our favor yesterday. So another level of victory. But the struggle continues because that same appellate court that knew that our rights had been violated by their own Constitution found a legal loophole in the decision of the jury to question the validity of the award. So we've got to go back to court to fight not the legal question. We won that. The right of freedom of speech was violated by the university and the state. But we have to go back into court to fight this technical question of the nature and definition and reason for the award. So that means more money. It's got to come out of our community to fight them. But they've messed with the wrong Africans at the wrong time in history. And no matter what it takes, we're going to fight them. Just as the Honorable Louis Farrakhan, having been victimized by a defamation process going on for years, has decided to raise the legal ante and go into the court to the tune of tens of millions of dollars. That's what we got to do. Beat them with their own weapons. Because we got the African mind now to do that. Beat them into the ground with their own legal system. So this case may go all the way up to the Supreme Court. We're prepared to take it there. Then it will be the landmark case on the deciding of speech. If we lose it, it will be the deciding case. If we win it, it will be the deciding case. Let's go up to the Supreme Court, because I want to be able to look Uncle Thomas in the eye. I want to be able to see whether someone could sit in the seat of Thurgood Marshall, whether someone could understand the legal legacy of a Houston. I want to be able to look them in the eye and read the spirit. But what I'm trying to tell you, brothers and sisters, we're on a victorious path. But we've got to be prepared to stay together and build together. We need a war chest to fight these legal battles. We need a war chest to put together our economic endeavors. We need a war chest to build the academic, school, educational institutions that we need. We need to find the economic means to pool our resources together to make a difference. And we can do it. $300 to $400 billion is earned by African peoples on the legal market. I don't know what is earned on the illegal market. But we got $500 billion in our hands. And as the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell said, what's in your hands, black man and black woman? Power, if you know how to use it. But if you don't use it, other people will be there to use it. Other people are coming into your communities, continuing the Holocaust of devastation and destruction and death. Other people are coming in, still taking your economic capability from your hands, still taking your educational capability from your hands, still taking your cultural capability from your hands, still exploiting your music, still miseducating in your schools, and still controlling your economic sustenance. And it doesn't make any difference who they are. We can call the names. Everybody knows, but it's the system of white supremacy that has designed this process of African powerlessness and impoverishment internationally. So as we go forth, brothers and sisters, we need a systems analysis, which I want to be able to get into. But as you know, I operate in a deep African tradition. They've made me a chief in Ghana among the Ashanti people. They've made me a chief and a captain in the Asafo warrior company among the Elmina people, and the ceremony took place in the Fort Dungeon concentration camp of Elmina on the coast of Ghana last year. So you know I can't do anything without acknowledging that which went before me. I can't do anything without acknowledging the 100, 200 plus million African souls lost in our Holocaust of enslavement. And because many of us have Native American background, Native American blood, Native American spirit, and mine is just across the river in Virginia, the Powhatan Indians from my mother's family. I stand here before you speaking not only for the hundreds of millions of Africans lost in that system of death and destruction called the African Holocaust, but the 50, the 60, the 100 million Native Americans lost in the Holocaust. If we're going to have Holocaust studies in these United States and other areas of America, we've got to deal first and foremost with the first and foremost devastation on these lands, and that is the Holocaust of the Native Americans, which was initiated by Christopher Columbus himself. And if we're going to have Holocaust studies in these United States, then the most devastating Holocaust ever conceived in the mind of humanity has to be a part of that process, and that's the African Holocaust of enslavement imposed in these United States, the islands of the Caribbean, and in South America. And after we have this in place, then we'll worry about the various other processes of Holocaust that took place, because all of them come out of this system of white supremacy, and we need to appreciate and understand that. But that which occurred in Europe, the European Nazi Holocaust of the European Jew, has to do with white-on-white crime. It has nothing to do with African peoples, Asian peoples, Native American peoples. That's why they're coming at us. Because power is the ability to define reality and have other people respond to your definition, and we redefine that reality. And you're going to have to deal, the world is going to have to deal with the Holocaust of African peoples. We can't expect to have a meaningful 21st century unless we deal with it. And in the African tradition, we've got to remember those who went before us. We've got to remember our African ancestors. And a very simple tradition is a part of that. That's the libation. Nothing important happens in the African world without a libation. We're about to make a major breakthrough in terms of recapturing the African mind, liberating the African mind and spirit. So this is a major endeavor, and it's necessary for me to have the libation. Libation in the African communal process means that you participate. You don't sit there like Negroes from Howard without anything to say. As the water is poured to the ground, you acknowledge it in an African tongue if possible. Acknowledge it in the Yoruba tongue and civilization, Ashe. Acknowledge it in the Afrikan tenant civilization, Yao. Acknowledge it in any African language that you may know. Hotep in the ancient Medu Neter. But don't sit there like Negroes from Washington without anything to say. Our studies are raising the Holocaust of African enslavement is to acknowledge the hundreds of millions lost in the wars in Africa, in the Middle Passage, and in the hells of North America, South America, and the Caribbean. And we include the Native Americans, our blood and our family in that. So in the name of Africans who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa, we ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of the Africans who began the march of humankind in the womb of Mother Africa, Great Lakes region, and marched down the Nile Valley, 4,000 miles of the Nile, the Blue Nile, the White Nile, the Atabara, laying the foundations of culture and civilization, raising their pyramids and temples to their God concept. We ask these Africans, the great Khufu, the great Khafra, the great Menkaura, we ask these Africans, the great Zoser, the great Imhotep, to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. In the name of these Africans who laid this enormous foundation of culture and civilization for the world, laying the foundations of science and medicine, laying the foundation of architecture, laying the foundation of diplomacy, laying the foundation of statecraft, these Africans who laid the moral barometers, philosophy, Africans who opened up Africa to other peoples and laid the foundations for Judaism, Christianity, Greek civilization, and Islam. We ask these Africans to be with us, to strengthen us, and give us a vision for the future. We ask these Africans who took this culture of liberation, this culture of respect, this culture of